Navy Matters.
Hello, and thank you for joining me today. I'm your host, Liam Carballal, and on this episode of History Repeats, I am joined by my guest, Richard Acritelli. It's nice to see you again, Rich.
Liam, how you doing, buddy?
Yeah. Today, we are going to be talking about Japanese war crimes during World War II, specifically Unit 731. Richard, I believe you mentioned before we started rolling today that you actually wrote an article for this the subject for your local paper. Is that correct?
Yeah, I wrote something for today, and then I've done a lot of work on prisoners of war from World War II. One of them was a man, Arnold A. Boxel, who wrote a book called Rice, Men, and Barbed Wire. He lived in Syosset, and he was later liberated by the Soviets after about 3 years of imprisonment during World War II. He survived the Bataan Death March, and right next door we have the Merchant Marine Academy and Maritime, and he had gone to Maritime, so he laid mines in the Bataan Peninsula, Corregidor Bay, and that was the last
sea
place.
Mines.
Yeah, sea mines, and it was a mine-laying ship. And he was actually at Corregidor with MacArthur before MacArthur got pulled out of there by PT boats and eventually brought to Australia. Wow. So
that's incredible. Now, this was in Manchuria or Manchukuo, correct?
Yes. He was liberated. That's provinces of China, a lot of resources, minerals, raw materials. For Japan, it was not a large country, but large population. If any country is going to expand greatly, they need raw materials.
Yes.
Japan's an island nation with not many raw materials, so they kind of use the Chinese, the Koreans, and later the Thai and the Vietnamese, and almost every other group towards the doorstep of Australia for those raw materials. Yeah. So he was a citizen that lived maybe 15 minutes away from here at the Holocaust Museum and the studios here. So a lot of history around us.
Wow. So I think we would benefit a little bit if we kind of talked about how Japan began its road towards fascism. The Meiji Restoration. I think people forget that Japan is like a modern state. It's fairly new. They were still a feudal society as late as the 1860s. But the U.S., they opened up Japan in 1853. They began trading, modernizing its military. Japanese Empire, as we know it, though, it became more fascist in the 20s. Can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, well, the Japanese gets opened up by Perry. And in under 100 years, they go from being, like you said, a feudal society, a little backward, very closed-minded. They see American ships come into their ports. Ships get shipwrecked, and they have people with pitchforks stabbing our sailors. Yeah. So they go from that line of thinking to the end of the 1800s, where they quickly modernize. You had something here in terms of the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Japanese Gentleman Agreement, right?
Yeah, 1905.
Right. So yeah, you have the two different immigration laws, right? The Chinese would say to their people, we're going to give you a ride, to the harbor. We wish you good luck, but don't come back here. Yeah. Because we don't have the food or resources for you. The Japanese were the opposite. Yeah. We want you to go to schools like Stony Brook University and Adelphi and, Westbury, which is right down the road, and, Columbia in New York City and all these different places, right? Cornell upstate.
Japanese went to American colleges?
American schools, right? Learn English, learn mathematics there, architecture, science, engineering, literature. And we want you to bring it back here. Yeah. And because this is a way of us getting westernized and a way of us, growing against the Western Europeans and the, the Russians and expansion and stuff like that. We want to start going up against them there.
Yeah.
Okay. So you look at the immigration to the country, the Japanese, some of them were expected to go back and to share that information.
Yeah.
So they rapidly expanded against us. World War I, they're going to fight on the Allied side, or if you want to call it the Triple Entente side.
Yeah.
You know, it's something. The Russo-Japanese War and World War I, they were fully civilized. It was like fighting against gentlemen.
Yeah.
Okay. The Russo-Japanese War itself, okay, what you're going to look at, okay, is that they actually treat their prisoners of war better than how the Russians were treated by their own government.
Yeah.
And the Tsar ended up coming up with, you know, ways of making humanity better for the prisoners of war.
Yeah.
And his country was a complete disaster. And that was probably one of the reasons why they fell, you know, 15 years later, because they were not a modern power, and the Japanese was always in their shadow, and they were only growing, getting stronger. You know, it's like almost like a racehorse, right? Or a thoroughbred. They weren't quite there yet, but they were moving in that direction in order to compete and run.
You just mentioned that Japanese POWs or Russian POWs during the Russo-Japanese War and German POWs in World War I were treated better than.
That's the irony of it all, right?
Would they continue to treat POWs well?
Well, they followed the Hague, and they signed Geneva in 1925. But somewhere they just, it's like you looking at somebody and you scratch your head and you say, we don't understand why they're acting like this here.
Yeah.
They've never done this before. Okay. And it's like that with the Japanese government. They were civilized people. They were very well educated. You know, they grow into almost like a middle class. They want education. Okay. The Russo-Japanese War, they're treating the Russians better. And it was so noticeable because English observers of that war actually came out and said that there's nothing negative about the Japanese conduct.
Yeah.
World War I's the same thing. The fighting maybe is not on the same scale as you see in World War II 20 years later. But the conduct was there. That was something that was consistent. And then in 1920, you're going to see Japanese military are going to take more of a prominent role within the government, more of an influence over the emperor, okay? And then they just, it's like that kid. They just fall off the bike somewhere along the lines, and it's very disturbing, very disturbing. Like you look at where we are here at the Holocaust Museum, okay? All you have is kind of like terror all around us, right? It just, there's not too many positives here in terms of what the government had done with wide-scale genocide, right?
Yeah.
But the Germans were a middle-class people and a strong people. And, you know, there was that point in the early 1930s. They just went in that direction, and they couldn't bring themselves back.
Yeah.
You know, they got to a point where there was no coming back. And you look at the Japanese, I think it shocked a lot of people in the 1920s. Yeah. But the Japanese were fortunate for two reasons. One, you have what, over 20 million people, right, killed during World War I and massive casualties.
They didn't take any casualties.
Right? So they're not like France, where a third of their country is destroyed. The British barely retain their empire, right, and so on. They're untouched, but nobody wanted war. All right? General John J. Pershing at the end of World War I says the Germans might have been defeated, but they don't believe they were beaten. Yeah. And it's going to take 20 years down the road to fix this problem again. So you have the fact that nobody wants to fight a war. They don't want that as part of their foreign policy any longer. So like we spoke about in the last segment, right? The Washington Naval Conference, Locarno, Geneva, Kellogg-Briand. What does that do? It puts war on the shelf somewhere. So now the Japanese and then later the Germans and the Italians to a really lesser degree are going to be able to use that to their advantage. And then the second thing on top of that is the Depression. Okay? You look at where we are up here in Glen Cove. 25% of the population was out of work at one time. nobody, and it's a bad thing, it's a really bad thing to say, but there's a lot of honesty to it. It's a rough honesty. Nobody's going to care about people that's half a world away.
Yeah.
During World War II, they had
All
to go.
politics is local.
Yeah, they had to go to, you know, like the tire companies to figure out where some of these places were. They had no idea. They just said that's in Asia somewhere or that's in the Pacific somewhere. They're not going to care when they don't know when their next meal is coming. You know, and you know, you had people, they didn't want to give money away because they didn't know when the next quarter or penny or dollar was coming in. Yeah. So that was the, I would say that was the cover. Cover, I guess, is a key word because, you know, FDR is like his cousin, right? He's not only a domestic president, but he's a foreign policy president. And these guys know what's going on. They knew about the first concentration camps in Germany in 1933, and they know about the Japanese expansion. But how are they going to sell that to a public who is barely holding on and is concerned that capitalism and democracy has failed in the 1930s? So the Japanese are able to move and do what they feel as though that they need to do with that aggressive policy. And then that's kind of where I think we're going to get to, where it's really scary how quick a country can move in that direction. You know, I mean, like you look at the Germans, right? We spoke about this with the Holocaust. Americans went into Germany and they said, these people look like our people here. They have homes like us. They have toilet paper. They have heat. They have all these different things. And it wasn't until we got into the camps that American soldiers went nuts, right? But they understood more about the Germans, right? Because who are the two largest immigrant groups? The Germans and the Irish. The Japanese might as well be, you know, out in, you know, Saturn or Neptune somewhere. They're just, there's a disconnect there. Okay? Outside of the West Coast and maybe small areas here, you know, on the East Coast, there's just a disconnect. What are people going to say? Ah, it's unfortunate. That shouldn't be happening. But what's the unemployment rate? The economics dictates our foreign policy. We're like today, how much money are we in debt today? $37 trillion. That is, right? That's dictating our foreign policy because you've got to be able to pay for that stuff. And they have to get that under wraps. And that's what Americans said in the 1930s.
You mentioned the Washington Naval Treaty. It's interesting. The Japanese militarists, they were galvanized because they hated that because they felt like they were being constrained. They're a country. Same with the Treaty of Versailles.
They're a country that's based off of the sea. They're islands. And Asia's a huge place, not only a land base, but I mean, where would you say Asia ended? At Guadalcanal, off the doorsteps of you know, Australia, and then you know, Wake and Midway. That's not too far away from Hawaii, right? So they have to have a navy, like we have to have a navy, because we're surrounded by the oceans. And they call that up until September 1st, 1939, the two-ocean belief, that the oceans would be enough to protect us with an adequate navy. Now, you bring up the Treaty of Versailles. Treaty is a disaster, right? But the Japanese tried to get some form of equality.
Racial equality.
Racial equality, which they figure out if we can get the racial equality, then that will go into the economic, the social, the political, and the military. That all goes hand in hand sooner or later. Okay? And they tried to put a clause in there of respect. And the Europeans knew all about it. We didn't really know about it. We didn't want to know about it because we make a separate peace with Germany in like 1922. Even though that's Woodrow Wilson's ideas, right? We said, no way. We're like a turtle. We go back in our shell of isolationism. So what you're looking at is they say, hey, can you meet us halfway here? And they basically block it. And then that enrages the Japanese, because now we're not taken seriously, you know? So, and I think that's where it's like two different sides of the coin there. So,
so when it comes to the biological warfare program, it starts with Major Ishishiro. Are you familiar with him?
A little bit. What I could tell you was that some of these leaders of that program were indicted after the war. Okay? But a lot of them weren't. And that's the crazy thing, is because of the Cold War. All right.
They killed innocent people, but because they could possibly provide weapons against the Soviets, we left them.
Well,
let them walk away.
it's the competition now.
Yeah.
It's the same thing with the Germans, right? Those German scientists for the V1 and the V2 rockets, and they were ahead of us. They were nowhere near us with the atomic bomb, but they were ahead of us with the rocket technology. Okay? There's a movie called October Sky with Jake Gyllenhaal.
Yeah.
And it's a great movie. I showed it to the kids in school about the working conditions in the coal mines in West Virginia and how these kids work their way out of the mines.
Yeah.
But the movie glorifies Wernher von Braun. He had blood on his hands.
Killed civilians.
He killed civilians,
Slave labor.
Jews, prisoners of war, you name it, they did it.
Yeah.
Okay? But we grabbed them. And in the movie The Right Stuff, it's like almost laughable. They'll say, well, our German scientists are better than the Soviet German scientists when we're losing the space race, right?
Yeah.
Right? So when you're looking at the Japanese, it's the same thing. You know, I just wrote a story about all this, and I mentioned Joseph Mengele in Auschwitz. Well, they were doing very similar stuff. They had a structure of 150 buildings, an airfield, quarters for people, animals, and tunnels that get inside and outside, and very few people knew. At the end of the war, they come across these scientists because now the scientists are dangling that carrot of the Cold War in front of them and saying, we will help you. We know you're behind. We've made advancements. And what do? We turn our back.
Yeah.
You know, so, and they said that about immigration at the end of World War II, going into from 1945 to 1950. As long as you weren't a communist, it was very sketchy in terms of some of the records of the people. And it was nasty. It was nasty stuff. I got some of the experiments and stuff like that they did.
Snake venom, anthrax,
with the fleas, putting the sicknesses,
bubonic
plague, the bubonic plague. They injected horse urine into people to see how they could survive. They put people in gas chambers with their kids, and they were watching how long it would take for them to die and how they would respond to their kids dying. And then they ended up doing like pressure with like pilots and stuff like that. Okay, how high or how much pressure can a pilot take? And some of these experiments, their eyes started popping out.
Jesus,
it's the craziest stuff. So, and like, you know, like what do they say about Hitler with the camps? Oh, Hitler didn't know any of this. It was Goering, it was Goebbels, it was Himmler, it was everyone else. What do they say with the Japanese? Oh, the emperor didn't know anything about this here. And the emperor knew full well how fanatical his country came, because after 2 atomic bombs were dropped, young army officers came out and said, we are still not surrendering. And that comes from somewhere in the 1920s, that fanaticism, that code of Bushido comes about. Look at the Rape of Nanking, right? You asked me about the USS Panay, right?
Yes, I did.
And I think I answered it was, well, it was a Great Depression. Nobody really cared about it, okay? And it was a quick response, which I was correct, but there was a little bit more to it, okay? It was north of the city of Nanking. That ship was doing 2 things. It was getting Americans out of harm's way in Nanking, which was this huge industrial area.
Yeah.
The Chinese had fought this brutal battle in Shanghai against the Japanese. Even though they lost the battle, they made it very costly against the Japanese. So they were in a brutal mood. They raped, they pillaged, they destroyed, they killed on their way to Nanking. So it was like a storm that was coming in.
Yeah.
Okay? People knew it was coming, and then people went to Nanking and said, this is what you're going to face. So they set up a safety haven.
John Rabe.
Yeah, with the Europeans, and they called it the size of Central Park.
Yeah.
But it still didn't matter. It was like a limited, you know. And what you're looking at is that basically the USS Panay was there. They were escorting 3 oil ships from Standard Oil, Rockefeller's company, of which Rockefeller probably had homes right up where we are right here. And the Japanese dropped 20 bombs on the USS Panay, which was a gunship.
We were a neutral power.
Yeah, which was a gunship that operated in the waters of the Yangtze. It was built for that purpose. 20 bombs. If you drop one or two, then you can say, all right, this is an accident, it's a mistake. 20 bombs, they strafed the ship. And then what ended up happening was the commander of the ship gave the one order you never want to give, is abandon ship. And then when they swam ashore, the Japanese came in. 2 days, they bombed.
Yeah.
And then they end up given $2 million. I believe it was 1937. Imagine what that money's worth today. For damages, 3 people were killed. I think 43 sailors were injured. And then a couple civilians. Yeah. So the Japanese were just going off on this tangent that they weren't coming back from.
They killed 300,000 in Nanking?
In Nanking. They don't know what the numbers are. Because so many people were killed.
They're still finding bodies.
They're still, yeah, and their blood was literally flowing down the street. And then there was a German diplomat who sent reports back to the Third Reich and said, I can't believe our, our so-called friend, and this is before really the Axis get together, but they were gravitating towards each other, that our friend could do such a thing, And if you look at this time in the late 1930s, Hitler doesn't care about the humanity of anybody.
Yeah, right.
He goes into Austria, goes into Czechoslovakia. The concentration camp system is well underway, okay, and it's only growing, okay? And he sees any enemies or any inferiors as secondary people. So he can care less what's going on with the Japanese, and that's the irony of it, to tell you the truth, So.
You, as I mentioned before, you met prisoners who were in Harbin, Manchuria, right?
Yeah, Arnold A. Boxel, he was taken out of the Philippines during the Bataan Death March. He got a rifle butt to the face. So the Japanese, they did not give any water, any food. That is part of the code of Bushido, where if you give up fighting, right, anyone from the emperor to private soldier, if you give up fighting, we're going to treat you lower than a dog. All right? Now, MacArthur at the Philippines, that was not his finest moment. A lot of the planes were left on flight lines that were easily bombed. He had soldiers that were sporadically spread out. Okay? So Boxel ends up getting taken. And they actually went into the water where like the water buffaloes and animals were drinking dirty water, but they were so thirsty. And the Japanese were bayoneting them. Okay? So he ends up going from the Philippines. He goes on a Japanese hell ship that wasn't marked. American subs were operating in the area. Like Germans operated off of our coast, we operated off of their coast there, right? They end up having no markings itself. He goes to Korea. They send him to a warehouse to get him cold weather clothing. Goes up the Korean Peninsula. So remember, Korea is up here, so the weather is up here too. It's colder, right? And then they end up sending him to Manchuria. And he was imprisoned with British soldiers that were taken at Singapore and Hong Kong and places like that, and American soldiers. He was there. I think he was liberated at like 90 pounds.
Yikes.
So when you look at the Holocaust Museum here, the feature that you see with the people is that they're starving. You could be the heaviest guy in the world, the biggest guy in the world, and you have no nutritional value in you, right? Well, the American soldiers look like the Holocaust survivors when they were picked up out of the Japanese camps. And, that code of Bushido, being a veteran and being in the service, you're taught how to fight, and you're taught that fighting spirit, and you don't give in. But you're also taught something called UCMG, Uniform Code of Military Justice. There's certain things you don't do. And the Japanese took that book. They took Geneva, they took The Hague, and they threw it in the fire somewhere.
Geneva bans biological warfare. And they still, Hippocratic Both, and yet doctors in Japan were still performing live tests.
Yeah, and it went from a very small organization to an organization that grew over time. The government ends up doing this up until the very end of the war itself there. Very end of the war. So,
all right. Thank you, Rich. Thank you for tuning in to History Repeats on hmTV.